You will have to accept. Or if you don't accept, you'll just have this big annoying thing on your screen. So it's useful to accept. Okay. So we have been talking about in the Tanya. We've been having a wonderful discussion. As we've said, the Tanya is going to lead us to a place where we will serve God, not just by action, but internally, what goes on inside of us. And in order to do that, we have to first explain what goes on inside of us. We had chapter 1, where we talked about the animal soul. In chapter 2, we've been exploring the godly soul. And hopefully we will conclude the general discussion on the godly soul. Of course, it wouldn't be a Tanya if we wouldn't always discuss the godly soul, but giving you some background on the godly soul. Now, in our discussion of godly soul, we had to define what is the godly soul. And we explained and we defined the godly soul by saying the godly soul is a part of God. That's what the godly soul is. And we gave a couple of examples. We gave an example of blowing, just as it says God breathed into Adam's nostrils. That indicates giving of his essence, right? Breathing is harder than talking. So God gave his essence to us. We gave another example of a child coming from a parent, that the essence of the parent comes into the child. And we are called God's children, as we read in Exodus 2 weeks ago. Now, once we had the discussion, then we had to understand, well, if we all have a godly soul, why do some people seem to be more spiritually attuned than others? Why do some people have an easier time doing the right thing than others? Why are some people tzaddikim, righteous people? And to that we answered that although the soul in essence is the same, it goes through, quote unquote, a gestation period. Just as a child goes through a gestation period, it's made of the same elements, but through a gestation period, you have different elements of a body. You have a brain, you have toenails. Obviously, toenails seem less connected than the brain, although in essence, they are all made of the same essence. Similarly, you have souls. Some are, quote unquote, processed more, some are less processed. And therefore, some will have an easier time connecting with their source, which is God, than others. And that is why we have a differentiation. Some people may feel more spiritual, some people less. Some people have an easier time doing the right thing, some people less. We ended off last week that nevertheless, despite our differences, we shouldn't be depressed because God makes us all different, because we each have a unique mission. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, good. All right. I just wanted to make sure this funny looking mic is working. Okay. This week, we are going to continue to explore the theme of the idea that along this idea of the gestation period, and it leads us to another important element in Judaism. So again, we said the godly soul, in essence, everybody's soul is godly. It comes from God. It's made of the same DNA, if you want to say, same strand. However, there's a gestation period creates different qualities of souls on this earth, if you want to say, right? Just as an example, you have toenails and you have a brain, although it's made of the same stuff, but it comes out looking different, although technically they're all still connected, right? As long as a toenail is alive, it's connected to the entire body, and the entire body is made from the parent. Similarly, each soul is always connected with God. It has a different mission, though, as a toenail. Toenail has a mission too. However, all this will bring us to an interesting understanding. And this goes back to what we said earlier. If we use the example of a child, the brain is more obviously connected to the parent than other elements of the body, right? The brain has its higher functioning, seems more obviously connected, So similarly, it says in souls, there are certain, on top of that, the connection of the nail, the toenail or the foot to the parent, to an extent, runs through the brain. Why? Because although the nail or the toenail is technically created of the same stuff as the brain is more obviously connected, and everything is connected to the brain. Okay? So again, the toenail, the fingers, the feet are connected to the brain, and by its connection to the brain, it's connected to the parent. Okay, so we're going to say similarly, we as souls on this earth connect to God through the righteous people of the generation, through the leaders of the generation. Now you might say that sounds like not Jewish. Like, so we're what does that mean? Am I now believing in intermediaries with God? Right? Can I not connect to God myself? And the answer is twofold. Number one is, as we said the whole time, it's like a body. When there's a tzaddik, when there's a righteous person, and they help you connect to God. You're not, you don't connect to them and then they connect you with God. They're helping you connect to God. And if you want to put it, it's like a body. It's like an entire body. The toenail, right? So a body is all inherently one. When you use a tzaddik to connect to God, and it's sourced in Jewish sources, which we'll show soon, they are not acting as an intermediary because they are part of you and you are part of them. Intermediary typically means that there's separate intermediary, right? Like, so there's a king, and then there's a minister, and then there's you, right? Those are all separate entities. We're not saying that over here. The tzaddik and you are in a way one as well, by virtue of your souls. But even more than that, I want to take it one step further. The tzaddik, what makes a tzaddik, what makes a righteous person, what makes the leaders special? Going back to the analogy of the gestation period, the tzaddikim, the righteous people, so to speak, plop on this earth with very little processing, if you want to say, very little processing. Here on this earth, they live as very spiritual, almost as if they were in heaven. And what they do to us is they awaken within us what's really deep within us. In other words, we also have a godly soul. We also have a pure soul inside of us. The only problem is we have a harder access to our pure soul. By seeing other people where their pure soul is always shining, it's almost like a mirror and allows us to access our godly soul. It reminds us of who we really are. Just to so this is just to explain, for example, people like myself, many people have today pictures of great rabbis and tzaddikim and righteous people throughout their house. And people want to know, is this idolatry? And the answer is that, in a sense, it's almost like looking in a mirror. When you look at a righteous person, they are an embodiment of what your soul really is. They help you realize of what your soul really is, your godly soul. The only problem is our godly soul in our bodies doesn't shine all the time. The godly soul in a tzaddik is always shining all the time. So we look at them for the inspiration, and it's almost like looking at a mirror of ourselves, looking at our own godly soul. There was, and just to bring this home further, the Rabbi, Lubavitcher Rabbi, obviously for many years, people would come and ask him questions. As time went on, he got busier and busier. And in a landmark talk in 1988, he said like this. He said that instead of people asking him questions, because it's been getting a lot, he says everybody should go and ask their own godly soul, and then look at the answer that they need. So then the Rabbi went on to explain, so how do you ask your godly soul, right? How do you tap into your godly soul? How do you ask it? And so he explains, obviously, you have to learn and pray and study Hasidic philosophy. But the point is, what the Rebbe was inherently saying is, why do people come to me? Because it's a more direct access to their godly soul, right? In connection with our godly souls. So he was advising, when you don't have access to me, find a way to access your own godly soul. Obviously, it's a lot easier to go to a Rebbe. But my point being here is that when we go to a Rebbe, a tzaddik, a righteous person, a great leader, when we have pictures of them, again, it's not idolatry. It's saying, I know I have a godly soul. I need someone that their godly soul shines to help me access my godly soul. there was a story. Yehuda Avner was a prime minister for many of the was a minister for many of the prime ministers of Israel, for 5 of them to be exact. He wrote a big book called The Prime Ministers, and he tells the story in there that one time he went to the Rabbi as a liaison for the different Israeli ministers, and he asked the Rabbi, what is the job of a Rabbi? And the Rabbi said, the job of a Rabbi is like this. He says, you see there's a candle. The candle has a wick and it has the wax. And he says, the wax is like the body and the wick is like the soul. And so my job is to light the soul of the, of the Jewish people. So then Yehuda Avner, as he walks out, he says, so Rebbe, did you light my soul? And the Rebbe says, I've given you the match. You have to light your soul. You have to light it yourself. So that's exactly what it is. A Rebbe, a tzaddik, they give us the match. They inspire us. They allow us to connect to ourselves. Because going back to the analogy of the child, the brain is more obviously connected than the nails. And so the brain can inspire us, but ultimately it's up to us to do our own job, right? So nobody can do it for us. The tzaddik can inspire us, be an inspiration to us, but ultimately we have to take that final step and strike that match, so to speak. You get the match, it makes it easier than trying to, maybe bang some Flintstones together. But, we have to take that final step. He inspires us. And with this, the Tanya will explain a very interesting statement of the Talmud. The Talmud says, I believe it's in the Talmud. He'll say the source over there. Where is it from? It's from Kesubas. Yeah, the Talmud says, and we'll read it in a moment. The Talmud says the Torah says in Deuteronomy that you have to connect to God, attach yourself to God. And the sages in the Talmud ask, how do you attach yourselves to God? And the sages in the Talmud answer, if you attach yourself to a Talmid Chacham, to a righteous person, a scholar, it's as if you are attaching yourself to God. And the question is, how so? How is connecting to a sage connecting to God? And so now we understand. Just like the nail, so to speak, the nail of the child is more obviously connected to the parent through the brain. Similarly, we more obviously get connected to God through the help of our tzaddikim and righteous people of the generation. The Zohar, in fact, calls Moses. The Zohar talks about Moses, and it says Moses we know was a shepherd by trade. And the Zohar says Moshe is called Roa Neman. He's called the faithful shepherd. And the Zohar says, what does it mean? He was a shepherd to the Jewish people. He would shepherd them and give them all their needs. What are all their needs? He would give them faith. Moses gives us faith. How does Moses give us faith? By virtue of his personality and his teachings, Moses gave the Jewish people faith. And the Zohar says, similarly, in every generation, there are people that are like the Moshe that give us the faith in God. Okay, so let's take a look now at text. So all what I said, you'll see it inside, and then we'll open up for some questions, maybe a couple more stories. And then we, of course, have the next section after this. Okay. In section 2, our emphasis was on the relationship between the souls and God. In section 3, we'll discuss how souls can influence each other. Above, the Tanya stated, in the child, the nail draws their spiritual nourishment and energy from the brain and the child's head. The child is symbolic of the collective souls of Israel. So the implication here is that lower souls of ordinary people, the child's nail, can be spiritually nourished by the souls of our teachers, the child's head. Again, going back to the analogy, just as a soul connects more through the brain, we connect through our brains, quote unquote, which are the righteous people. So he says, this is because the nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which we explained last time, different elements of the soul, of the simple folk are nurtured and energized from the nefesh, ruach, and neshama, the different elements of the soul, of the tzaddikim, spiritual giants, and the scholars, the heads of the children of Israel in their generation. The idea of a soul connection between spiritual master and disciple became a central focus of the Hasidic movement, though as the Tanya will now demonstrate, it is based on earlier sources. Let's continue. And this explains the teaching of our sages of blessed memory on the verse, and attach yourself to him. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. And the Talmud explains, what does it mean attached to God? The Talmud says that anyone who attaches himself to scholars is considered by scripture to have attached himself to the divine presence. So it says in the Talmud, literally. Seems at first glance that we might attach ourselves to the divine presence through connecting with human teachers, but based on the above insight, the fundamental connection between all souls we can understand as literally. Why? He explains. Because by attaching themselves to the scholars, the Nefesh, Ruach, and some of the simple folk become consciously connected with the original source and root in the supernal wisdom of God. Right? So this goes back to the original analogy, right? It says in the Torah that we come, it says that just as a child comes from the brain of the parent, we explained that at length last time, we come from the brain of God, God's wisdom, and we explained how God's wisdom is one with him. So all he's saying here is that when the Talmud says that by connecting to a scholar, we connect to God, it doesn't mean, you carry their clothing and, you touch them and now you're connected to God, right? It's not an idolatry way. As he says here, our souls, us, the simple people, we become more consciously connected with our original source. Notice we are part of our original source, but we're not so conscious of it. The tzaddikim, by virtue of their teaching and their personality, allow us to connect with what with what is truly us. So he just ends up here, and once connected with the supernal wisdom, they are connected with God himself, since he and his wisdom are one, and he has the power to know, which we explained last time. So let's just read. The concept of tzaddikim and scholars as a soul nexus can be understood through the relationship of an electrical powerhouse with a lamp that is connected to it by a wire. In order to light his lamp, one must find the right switch or push the correct button. The soul of every Jew is part of and is connected with God, but in order for one to enjoy the great benefits of it, the correct switch must be found or the proper button to be pushed. All right, so imagine there's, our connection to God runs through certain wires and elements and switches, and that runs through our great sages. Through attachment to a tzaddik, the Tanya suggests it becomes easier to find that switch. Okay. Now you might ask, and this is what the Tanya is going to say. All right, so if we're explaining that we connect more consciously to our spiritual self through the great sages, what happens if we don't like them? Okay, you can go in the Torah. The Torah is replete of people who who didn't like the scholars. Whether if we go back to the times of Korach, led a revolt against Moses. You have Dasan and Aviram. But throughout the generations, there were people who said, we don't need the scholars. We can just open up the books and study ourselves. We don't need the great tzaddikim and scholars and righteous people. Happens all the time. So what about them? How do they connect with their godly soul? And the answer is that it's definitely more difficult for them. Because, as we said, the connection, just as the nail is more directly, obviously connected to the parent through the brain, we can get a easier conscious connection to God through the righteous people of generation. If we choose to cut ourselves off from them, we will have a harder time accessing our souls. And he says, in Tanya, if you do cut yourself off, it will be like you can never cut your soul off from God. However, the conscious connection will be much harder. And he gives an example. He says, they can still get some spirituality, but it's in a backhanded way. He uses the word backhanded. In other words, let's say I want to give you something. If I like you, I'm going to give it to you directly. But let's say, for example, you're in a fight with somebody else. And for whatever reason, you have to deliver a package to them. Maybe your parent asked you, maybe a friend asked you. You don't want to let people know about your fight, right? So you don't get along, but you have to have some type of interaction. You need to give the other person something. How are you going to give that person that item? You're not going to walk over to them and say, hey, my enemy, Stan, here, take this package. You might walk to his door, throw it over your shoulder, ring the doorbell, and run away. Right? You're going to give it backhanded in a way that shows you're not very excited about it. Okay? So when that happens, you are giving something to the other person, but there's no warm, fuzzy inner feelings, no deep connection going on. And it says the same thing works by people who rebel against the sages of the generation. They will not be able to receive a direct and easy access to their soul. It will be in a very external way. Not that, the righteous person will ever give up on them, but they are going to have a much harder time connecting with it. In other words, they will have trouble feeling godly feelings. So it's kind of a bad place to be in. Because once you're in that place, then you're going to feel less godly, then you're also less likely to connect. So all this is to say is like this. We all struggle spiritually, but we have the opportunity to make our spiritual struggle easier by connecting with people greater than ourselves, people who have their godly soul shining through a little bit more, people who have their who have a greater aura of their godly soul. And that's a way that we can connect, and it makes our job easier. It's not expected for us to do everything. We should take advantage. This is the way God set it up. God set it up in this way that we should accept and receive the help. Yes, we do have to do something, but we do have to accept and receive that help. And it's true. It's hard to become spiritual just from text. Even the Tanya itself, the Alter Rebbe wrote in the introduction of the Tanya, well, it's a great book to read on your own. He says, but if you have questions, go to a sage, go to someone who's learned it before, who knows a thing or two. Today, we have all these people who, read online, websites and think they know everything, right? So that, there's nothing like experience, nothing like hearing from someone who's been there and done that. How many people go into their doctor today and they've read WebMD, and now they're more knowledgeable. Questions are fine. Same thing in Judaism. Questions are great. Read online, study, listen to everything, but there has to be that interaction of at least studying from a person, not just a book. Today you can do that. Actually, YouTube is a great source. It kind of, to an extent, you still probably will need to ask someone once in a while questions, but the online form is also good. Someone's writing, we can go to Rabbi Pinchas. So it's actually an interesting thing. Now, obviously, I don't want to accept upon myself that I'm like a tzaddik, I'm a very righteous person, but I will not disagree that I will agree that to an extent, my role is to help you. And I want to tell it with a story. There was in the second Hasidic Rebbe was known as the Maggid of Mezrich. And the Maggid of Mezrich, he wasn't like the Baal Shem Tov so much. The Baal Shem Tov was very close to the simple folk. The Maggid of Mezrich wasn't as much. He was more, although he dealt with them, but he was more like a leader of leaders. He created this holy society. He had a bunch of other tzaddikim, righteous people, and they were spread to the communities to reach out to the simple folk. So the Maggid of Mezrich had a disciple in a certain town. I forget which disciple it was, but he had a Rebbe in a certain town who was the leader of his town. And people there loved him, and they connected with him, and they felt closer to God through him. And there was one guy in that town where this disciple was, and he would always come to his Rebbe in that town and give him money, once a year, give him money, his profits and everything, help support him. Anyways, one year he comes to visit his Rebbe, and they tell him, your Rebbe's out of town. They say, where is he? Oh, he's visiting his Rebbe. He went to the Maggid of Mezrich. So this simple guy decides, well, listen, if I'm giving money to this Rebbe over here, and I make good money, I'm doing pretty well, let me go travel to his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich. If I go give him my charity, then I'll become even wealthier. So I'll up my business model over here. So he goes to the Maggid of Mezrich and he gives him some money, and his business starts going down the tubes. So he comes back. I think he came back to the Maggid of Mezrich, And he says, look, you're the Rebbe of my Rebbe. I gave you the money and my business is bad. He says, listen, every soul has its pathway and its connection to God. And your teacher connected through me, but you're supposed to connect through your teacher, through your Rebbe. And so that's as we said before, there's the pathways and the ways to our switch of our godly soul. And so he was saying that, and it's not to say, don't ever come to me, but he was saying, give your money to him because he's your primary connection. That's the way that you will connect, to God is primarily going to be through him. So that being said, I don't hold myself as anything I'm not a tzaddik, definitely not as we'll learn in Tanya. I'm far from being a tzaddik. I definitely see a role in helping you. That doesn't mean though that you shouldn't be inspired by tzaddikim as well. Please do not put a picture of me in your house. I'll tell you that much. Don't hang up. But actually, on that note, I was actually just to give an example of this, talking about we had a week ago, we had these Holocaust survivors, like a week and a half ago, Holocaust survivors at the synagogue. We had a program with a bunch of kids. It was like a kids challah bake with Holocaust survivors, and there was one guy there. He's originally from Morocco. Then he was in France during the war. And he told me he grew up in, I think it was Worcester. He was in Worcester for many years. This guy named is Chaim, Holocaust survivor. So I said, Chaim, did you know Rabbi Fogelman? Rabbi Fogelman was a legendary Chabad rabbi in Worcester. He lived a very long life. I think he was sent in the 50s already, maybe even before, maybe even the 40s. I don't remember exactly. Maybe even it was from the previous Rebbe. He was there for many years, had a school. And so I asked him, did you know Rabbi Fogelman? He's like, oh, Rabbi Fogelman. And he starts talking about Rabbi Fogelman. And then he told me, he says, I have in my house a picture of Rabbi Fogelman hanging up in my house. When I see him, I feel connected. Now, Rabbi Fogelman was a much holier guy than I am. But what my point is that, obviously, was he worshiping Rabbi Fogelman? No, but it gave him that feeling and connection to his godly soul, that warm and fuzzy feeling inside of connecting to his godly soul. And, so that's really the idea here, is that having tzaddikim and talmidei chachamim and all these are all ways of connecting. Of course, as a Chabadnik, I'm going to say that, obviously Chabadniks, we get inspired by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and, we follow his details of his life and his teachings. And most of what I teach are from his teachings. So by extension, if you come to me, you got to take down a picture of me. Yeah. By extension of, what I teach, a lot of it comes from the Chabad Hasidic teachings. Okay. Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Hopefully you understand a little bit better when you see people, quote unquote, worshiping a tzaddik. They're not worshiping the tzaddik. That's their inspiration and how they feel connected to God. Okay. From
what we're talking about, I get in my head, that the adage like attracts like, but this goes beyond that. It's like, it doesn't have to be, our teachings is to break that tradition of like, attracts like, and say, you have the opportunity to attach yourself to something greater than yourself. I like that. I like that a lot. It inspires me.
Well, if you want to see, if you want to use the analogy of light, let's just say a tzaddik, a very righteous person, has a lot of light, beaming out of them, and we have a little light inside of us. It feels like a little spark, and so when we see this big light, it awakens our light that's inside of us, the latent part of us that's there will come out. I was thinking of an example. There's examples, physical examples, when you have a much larger thing, it absorbs the smaller elements. I'm not recalling off the hand, but I don't know. I mean, if you have a big bonfire, you take a little match, it'll eventually become absorbed by the big fire, or things like that. Anyways, all right. We are now going to the next topic. The next topic is, and this, hopefully we will end chapter 2, is the, actually, Yeah, this will be the end of chapter 2. So by the way, just one last thing. So, how do you connect to a tzaddik? Just to understand, how does a tzaddik inspire you? You can watch them, but most importantly, you study their teachings, and their teachings can inspire you, particularly a tzaddik who was of your generation. I was having this discussion with my father-in-law. He was like, well, if we're studying teachings of somebody, why is it important to study teachings of a tzaddik of our generation? I could read stuff from 10 generations ago, which is true. We should as well. And his answer was that, yes, 10 generations ago, they were inspiring, but to an extent, the teachers and the tzaddikim and the righteous people of our generation talk in a certain lingo that talks to us more, right? Because we live in a society today. And so reading and studying teachings of a more current tzaddik will inspire us more. Anyways, just a side point. All right, now we're going to talk about the last element. We've been talking about the godly soul. We've been talking about all different ways it gets affected. We discussed gestation. We discussed tzaddikim, righteous people. Finally, we're going to end off with parents. What role do parents have in your soul? And the Tanya is going to say that ultimately, your actual soul, this may be good news for some of you, bad news for others, I'm not sure. Your actual soul is not decided by your parents, okay? God decides what type of soul you're going to get, okay? If you recall earlier, we discussed in the beginning of the Tanya, the different gestation period, how a soul is affected, how it can be more spiritual or less spiritual. Your actual soul, whether you get a very lofty soul, whether you get, so to speak, a brain soul or, a mouth soul or a toenail soul, that's not up to your parents. And he brings the proof. He says, because we see sometimes you have very great parents with a child that seems to be very spiritually insensitive. And sometimes you have parents who are very spiritually insensitive with a child who seems very spiritually sensitive. So obviously, it's not coming from the parents. In addition to that, we know that the Torah tells us that, I don't know where it says. It says that there are 3 partners in creation of a person. It says that's why we have to honor our parents. It says there's 3 partners when we're born. There's our mother, our father, and God, right? Mother, father, and God. That goes to the old joke. I think I said it recently. I think I said it at the Shabbos table, right? On Shabbos, right? You have the kid in the Soviet Russia, and the teacher gets up and says, "Your father is Stalin, your mother is Lenin. What do you want to be when you grow up?" So all the kids in the class are saying different things: a doctor, a lawyer, this and that. And the Jewish kid in the class says, "Well, when I grow up, I want to be an orphan." Okay, so but anyways, we have our partners in creation is not Stalin, Lenin. It's our father, our mother, and our parents. So our father and our mother obviously give us physical. God definitely gives us a soul. What effect do our parents have? Do our parents have an effect on us spiritually? What do you think?
I think so.
I think so. Okay.
I think that that they basically, it's very difficult. Like a friend of mine who said it to after Derek, he needed to wear his kippah to sleep still. Like there, he explained to me, it's so ingrained in you from when you're a child. There's no other way. So if you grew up with atheists, like I did, same thing.
Okay, so let me back up actually. Okay, so let me back up then. All right, okay, so let me differentiate. There is nurture. In other words, obviously our parents have an effect on us the way they nurture us. No doubt. You're raised by atheists, or you're raised by very religious parents. That's going to make an obvious difference. The question is, can parents affect your nature? Can parents affect your nature beyond just the physical genes? Can they affect your spiritual nature? We're talking about the godly soul over here.
Yeah, I think so, Rabbi, because they're the ones that take you through the various life events, if you will. And if I remember from what you said from either last week or the week before, some of those life events help to shape our Jewish soul. So, your first haircut and your bar mitzvah and your wedding and all that stuff, if your parents are doing that in the right tradition, in the right way, and doing those things, I think that does help to mold that soul.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You don't look convinced.
Yeah, no, I am convinced. I'm going to add on to that, because what you're saying is that since our soul comes in stages, how we celebrate those stages and entering of our godly soul will affect how sensitive our godly soul will be, so to speak. I hear what you're saying. I want to add on to it. There has been science has slowly come around to an idea that Judaism has believed for a long time. And that is that parenting begins when? When does parenting begin?
Before the kid is born?
Even before the kid is born. Parenting begins at the moment of conception, and really a little bit before that. The Talmud talks about this. Just give a couple examples. Talmud says when a woman leaves the mikvah, okay, the woman is leaving the mikvah, she's going to go home to her husband, and hopefully they're going to have a child. It says if she steps out and sees the wrong things, she should go back to the mikvah. Why? Because what she sees will be implanted in her mind and will have an effect on the type of children that they will have. In fact, now you may find this disturbing, and we can explain it another time, but it says there was a great sage, Rabbi Yochanan, who would sit outside of the mikvah so that when the woman would come out, they would be able to see him. He was both spiritually and physically beautiful, and that would have an effect on the children that they would have. So in Judaism, parenting begins all the way at the beginning. And even during pregnancy, we all know how careful people are to protect their kids from certain things when they're young. God forbid they shouldn't hear cursing or they shouldn't watch certain shows. But while they're pregnant with their child, they're not careful. Science has actually shown that, while you're pregnant, different things that the parents hear can have an effect on the child that's growing. In Chabad custom, actually, there are certain things that a woman doesn't do during pregnancy because of the effect that it will have on her child. This has been going on for a very long time. We've known this for a long time, that parenting starts way, way in the beginning. We have to be very careful. We raise kids from the beginning. And so the Tanya is going to add here that not only, so to speak, what the child hears during pregnancy, you might say affects is already called nurture. But the Tanya is going to add an element of nature over here. And it's going to say like this: although your parents cannot decide on your godly soul, at the moment of conception, depending on how it is done, will have an effect on what's called the levush, the garment of their soul. Okay, what is the garment of the soul? The garment of the soul is like this. A garment allows us to interact with certain things. If you want to touch something that's in very hot water, our physical hands can't touch hot water, we put on a glove. You want to go in the snow, you want to throw a snowball, you put on a glove. Clothing can help us interact with things around us. You're a spaceman, you want to go into space, you need a whole spacesuit. You go into certain germ areas. You need to help people. You need to wear a hazmat suit. So garments can help us interact with certain areas. It says the same thing, our godly soul. Our godly soul is so spiritual, it doesn't really interact with the physical. And so it needs a levush, it needs a garment. It needs something to help it manipulate and affect and touch this world. Can you guess what the garment of the godly soul is? We've said it in our previous classes, but I don't know if you picked up on it. What helps our godly soul interface with this world? Any guesses?
Saying you're not talking about anything to do with our relationship with Hashem, right? Like how we.
Well, once I get to the answer, we'll see how it affects our relationship with Hashem. Yes, Adam?
Talus.
A talus?
And the
No, it's got to be more soul level.
tefillin.
No, those are mitzvahs. I'm saying What allows our godly soul to interact with the world is the animal soul. The animal soul, the more human soul, so to speak, our godly soul operates through our animal soul. Okay, so again, we have an animal soul. We discussed that at length in chapter 1. I'm sorry, I can't go over all of it now, but we have what's called an animal soul, or what you might call the human soul. It's the more physical soul. Our godly soul operates through our animal soul. And so here's what it says. The more animalistic the moment of conception is, the more animalistic the child's animal soul is going to be. The more love and connection and possibly spirituality, which is beyond this class, how to do so at the moment of conception. But the more love, connection, and spirituality that there is at the moment of conception, the person will have a more refined godly soul. And what does it help to have a more refined godly soul? The more refined the godly soul, the easier it is to tap into a more refined animal soul. And the more refined animal soul will allow you to tap into your godly soul more. We see this in our natures, right? Some people naturally have more tendencies to do negative things than others. And what we're saying here is it could be one of two things. It can either be that their soul is very spiritually insensitive, though of course it has sensitivity somewhere, or it can also be they have a very high godly soul, but their animal soul is very strong. And so it really blocks and makes it really difficult, I should say, to access their godly soul. And this is what's called a garment for the godly soul, because again, the godly soul can only operate through the animal soul. The animal soul is the human soul, the part of us, so to speak, right? When we say humans are just like, sophisticated animals. That's kind of what the animal soul is. The animal soul is the part of us that just wants to live, eat, breathe, and everything else. Well, that animal soul can be more refined or less refined. It can be more coarse or less coarse. And depending on how coarse it is, that will make the job of accessing our godly soul that much harder or that much easier. And so all this is dependent on our parents. So again, what effect do our parents have on our spirituality? The answer is, can they affect our actual godly soul? No, our godly soul is decided by God. What they can do is make our job connecting to our godly soul easier or harder, purely in the nature stage. At the moment of conception, they have that effect. Obviously, there's many years after that of nurture, but think about it like this. Giving them an easier nature will make the nurture all that much easier. So having the proper thoughts and intentions and connection at the moment of conception will hopefully make your job easier. Of course, again, as I said earlier, there's a variety of things that go into every child. And ultimately, when I look at parents that have a difficult child, I don't pin it on the parent. A lot of times there are parents that walk around and say, well, how come that child's misbehaving and my child behaves so easily? Well, there's different natures of different children. And it's not always necessary. Again, it's not completely up to the parents either. And it's not, it could be the soul God has given the child, and all. There's all different elements that go into this. But we as parents have to do our best to set up our children for the best success. And Tanya's telling you, where does that start? That starts at the moment of conception. That's where you can set them up for the best success. Can you promise your children success in life? No. But if you want to try and give them some element of success, you want to try it then. Okay. Let's take a look in the text. Did I see? Just one second. Okay.
Next page.
All right. Okay. So good. Someone actually writes here. I read something like that about Rebecca and Jacob and Esau. It's a good point, by the way. Yeah, I do need to go to the next page. Jacob and Esau. Look at that. You had great parents. I'm sure they had great thoughts at the moment of conception, but yet one was wicked and one was good. So that's why it's a good example. You can't pin everything on parenting. I'm sure, Rebecca and Isaac did everything they could, but still one of their kids was Esau, right? Okay, Yishmael, you could say, came from the mother's side, but where did Esau get all that evil from? Okay, maybe his soul was, well, he had a very high soul, but it was it was he had trouble accessing his spirituality, that's for sure. So that's just a good example. In case you're feeling guilty, always look at Esau. Okay.
How does that square with what we just talked about?
How does that square with what we just talked about?
Because presumably there was proper intent.
Yes, presumably,
And so
right.
Therefore, if one child for sure, so what happened? You know,
I think it was about the soul over there. I think his soul, the Hasidic philosophy explains the complication of his soul. On the one hand, it was very high, but down here it seemed very low. So it was rooted in a very high place, but down here it was very low. And his father, Isaac, was always trying to access the height of Esau's soul, but Esau never cracked, so to speak.
Can I
Okay.
ask a question?
Yes.
How do we know where we stand if we have a very high or low spiritual or like a high animalistic nature? How do we know?
I don't know the exact answer. What I can say is I definitely see in life some people are more spiritually attuned than others. Some people just have a more natural knack at connecting spiritually. And it's just how it is. Some people have a harder time. It's just how it is. This concept here explains some of that. This concept here also explains why some people seem to be able to reach greater heights than we can, just by virtue of what type of soul they have. And it just,
Not their experience? You don't think it has to do with their experience?
experience has an effect, but you can never change who you are. So what I'm trying to say is experience does have an effect, but it's not the whole story ever. When we tell kids, if you put your mind to it, you can be anything you want to be. It's actually not true, right? Life, it's not true. You put your mind to, no, you can't be anything you want to be. Some people have certain talents, certain areas, and not everybody can be who's Joe DiMaggio, right? Not everybody, for those who know Joe DiMaggio, not everybody can be Joe DiMaggio, right? You put your mind to it, you're still not going to become him, right? It's like not to get into anti-Semitic tropes over here, but like Jews, we haven't historically been very athletic, but we have bought a lot of sports teams. You do what you're good at, okay? And by the way, there are Jews now getting into sports. Maybe as we've lived out of the shtetl for a while, where our physical bodies are catching up a little bit to the rest of the world. We're not so malnourished anymore. But anyways, so that's my thought on that. Okay, maybe I'll but it is a good question. Okay, so let's read the text. So he says, and as for what is written in the Zohar and the Zohar Chadash, that the main determining factor of the soul's quality is sanctity during the actual sexual union, which simple folks fail to do, etc., which explains why their children are also simple, possessing ordinary souls. How does this square with our previous conclusion that all souls derive from the same lofty source of eternal wisdom? Tanya answers that the Zohar is not referring to the divine soul itself, but to its garment, lavush, a kind of spiritual interface through which the divine soul communicates with the animal soul. I know he's writing that. I just wanted to say there's a debate about what the garment is. I explained to you one opinion. Okay. This is because every nefesh, ruach, and neshama, meaning every soul without exception, possesses a garment derived essentially from his father's and mother's nefesh. This garment is a very broad reach, influencing all the mitzvahs that the soul performs, as well as the blessings that flow to it from above. And all the mitzvahs that the soul does are influenced by that garment, which protects the soul from transgressions of prior incarnations. And even the blessings that flow to the person from heaven are all given through this garment. So this garment, again, is the interface between your godly soul and everything. It is the quality of this garment and not the soul itself that depends on the sanctity of the parent's thoughts. If the parents sanctify themselves during conception, they will draw down a holy garment for the soul of the child. And even if it's a very lofty soul, it still needs the father's and mother's sacred intent during conception, because the garment influences all the soul's worship as well as the blessings it receives. Let's continue. But for the divine soul itself, its quality is not influenced by the parent's thoughts. As we see, sometimes the soul of an inestimably great person will enter the child of a disgraceful, lowly person, such as Abraham, who was born to Terach. Terach was an idolater who owned an idol shop. All this insights in section 4 was stated by the reason. Look at the Torah, Parshas Vayera. Time is Parshas Bereshit. Conclusion. every one of us receives a divine soul from God, regardless of our parents' intentions at the time of conception. So that's a comforting thought. Regardless of who your parents are, you still receive a godly soul. Maybe they might make your job accessing it more difficult, but there's definitely an element of that over there. So we have finished chapter 2, and just to cap off what we discussed, we really just started to prove that what is our second soul? Our second soul is godly. We brought different proofs. Once we discussed that everybody has a godly soul, that brought us a couple problems that Tanya had to, so to speak, explain to us. Number one, how can we be all godly if we sometimes seem different? And to that, we explained the gestation period. We explained that also gestation period also explains the concept of righteous people. And finally, we ended off how our parents can affect our souls. They actually can't affect our actual soul, but they can affect the garment that interfaces with us. Baruch Hashem, yes, we are perfect despite our parents. Correct. We have a God, in other words, we cannot give up hope. Every single one of us has a godly soul. That's the basic takeaway of the whole chapter, is to tell you, you have a godly soul. That's really the whole point. And throughout the chapter, it's answering certain questions that might arise. Well, how can you say we all have the same godly soul if this person looks better than me and that person looks better than me? The answer is, the gestation and how I gave a good example, the 4 worlds, how exactly it transmorphs, but we're all made out of the same DNA. And so we all have hope is really the purpose of this chapter. So this should give us hope for the rest of the Tanya. If you think Tanya is not for you, the Tanya is setting the record straight in chapter 2. It's telling you, as sure as you know you have an animal soul, you should be just as sure that you have a godly soul. And every godly soul is connected with God. Some might have easier, some might have harder time connecting with that consciousness, but that consciousness is there, and you can all access it. And truthfully, when we think about it, we all do know that we have a godly soul. And we can see the different areas of our life, whether faith, we all feel faith in our soul sometimes, whether it is our conscious, what some people call conscious. Some people might call it, sometimes we awaken with moments of spiritual clarity, Yom Kippur, or we might have moments where we do things completely altruistic. All those are clear and definite expressions of our godly soul, because our animal soul doesn't care about any of that. Won't have a momentary awakening of spirituality. It won't do something completely altruistically because it doesn't benefit you. The animal soul is completely selfish. And the only times it'll do something quote unquote selfless, as we explained in chapter 1, was if it benefits you in some other way. But complete selflessness only applies in the godly soul. Your animal soul is definitely not giving you faith that we all know that we have. Different times it comes out. And the conscious, right? Just an example of conscious. Let's say you did something wrong, but you benefited from it. Why would your animal soul be bothered, right? Sometimes we walk around and something's bothering us. That's a clear indication of our godly soul. So we all clearly know we have a godly soul, that conscious that bothers us. It's not coming from the animal soul. The animal soul is happy. Well, I stole the money and I profited. Nobody knows about it. I wasn't caught. I'm happy. Why does conscious bother you? Godly soul. So know in your heart that we all have a godly soul. There's hope for every single one of us. And over the next chapters, we will hopefully find ways to discover ways of tapping into our godly soul. And that's my spiel for today. And I'm going to stop the recording and